The other day I was talking about DNA and how teams have to be sold or otherwise merged just to stay afloat. Sometimes it's just simple business, other times it's a necessity. And one of the more prominent examples of the last 20 years is when the Brawn team emerged from the ashes of the old Honda team. And this story has been covered at length by loads of people, including myself. Although if you have access to the BBC iPlayer, the documentary fronted by Keanu Reeves should still be on there, as well as being on Disney Plus, was it? But either way, if you've got some way of watching that miniseries, it's fantastic. But Brawn was born, that rhymes, out of making sure that everybody still had a job. Honda abruptly called a halt to the Formula 1 project just before Christmas in 2008, meaning that several hundred people, including Ross Brawn, Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello, wouldn't have anywhere to go in the 2009 season. But after some talks with Honda and the acquisition of the team for £1, the Honda team was able to continue as Brawn through 2009. They were given enough of a budget to get through the year by Honda and managed to pull off the unthinkable. They won their first ever race and then went on to win the championship. And I think we've just passed the 16-year anniversary for that, and Jenson will be retiring from full-time racing this weekend. But while there was this fairy tale underdog story of Brawn rising from the ashes and winning the World Championship, and Jenson Button silencing the critics he'd had over the last 9 years or so because, well, he'd only won a single race before that 2009 season, it wasn't exactly rosy behind the scenes. The budget was tight. The advantage the car had in the early part of the season was the key to their success. Their innovative double diffuser and the rest of the car made it far superior to everybody else's, and it managed to enjoy supremacy to around the Turkish Grand Prix, where it was then clear that Red Bull had closed the gap, and McLaren and Ferrari were starting to get back into things after their 2008 fight that held back their 2009 development. Long story short, the car didn't get much, if anything, in the way of development, and Barrichello and Button were trusted to not smash up the cars, because there wasn't going to be any money for Brawn to build another one. So Brawn was looking for investment, one way or another. Richard Branson initially bought into the team with his Virgin brand, and MIG Bank came along as well, and Brawn was often found running sponsorship on a race-by-race basis, just to keep everything ticking over. But in the background there were discussions going on for a buy-in or a full-on takeover, and that would mean that the artist formerly known as Tyrrell would be able to keep on running for a few more years. And while I said that Virgin had bought in the period after the European Grand Prix at Valencia, Richard Branson said that the relationship would not be continuing. He took his money to one of the new teams that were coming in for 2010 instead. There are reports that Branson wanted a bit more involvement than what he was getting with the Brawn deal in terms of ownership, but Ross Brawn said in the Keanu Reeves documentary that there was actually the opportunity for Branson to get more of a prominent sponsorship deal, but Branson lowballed the team, feeling that they weren't going to get the same kind of success through 2010. But Nick Fry, working for Brawn at the time, got wind that BMW, much like Honda before them, was on the way out. BMW would continue to have the logos of the Malaysian oil company Petronas on the cars, which was a carryover from its days as the Sauber team. So Fry hopped on a plane and flew to Kuala Lumpur to see if there was any interest in Petronas switching their Formula 1 presence to this underdog team, the team that was making all the headlines in the motorsport media through 2009. Petronas said no to Brawn, but they were interested in a relationship with Brawn's engine supplier, Mercedes. So they said to Brawn, if you can get Mercedes to continue with you, then maybe we'll have another chat. Mercedes, meanwhile, their terms were a lot more, well, stress-inducing. Their terms were, win the championship, then we'll talk. Spoiler alert, Brawn won the championship. Commercially, Mercedes had an in, and they decided, with backing from the Abu Dhabi-based Arbar Investments Group, bought 75.1% of the team in November 2009. Mercedes had 45.1%, Arbar 30%. Now, having just hovered over their name on the Brawn Wikipedia page just to look at some stats and get pictures ready for the video, Arbar is part of the Mubadala investment group. Mubadala. Where have I heard that name before? Oh yeah, they were the group that bought into Spiker, weren't they? I told you this sport is incestuous. And the reaction to all of this was largely positive. Remember, Formula 1 had lost Honda in 2008 and were going to lose BMW and Toyota at the end of 2009. BMW was sold back to Peter Sauber and Toyota disappeared entirely, with no buyer. And the car that Toyota designed for 2010 is one of those cars that's claimed to be the fastest thing on four wheels. It somehow gains half a tenth of a second every time someone talks about it. While there were the three new teams coming in for 2010, nobody was really giving them much time. Formula 1 needed manufacturers, and in the middle of the credit crunch, Mercedes coming back was well received. Okay, I say Mercedes was coming back. They'd been involved in Formula 1 since the early 1990s. Ilmor engines in the back of Peter Sauber's first F1 cars, and they also supplied the short-lived Pacific team in 1994. Then they began a semi-successful but often strained relationship with McLaren in 1995. That relationship with McLaren beginning 40 years after Mercedes abruptly withdrew from Formula 1 following the Le Mans disaster of 1955. Although Mercedes had been present in other forms of racing since 1955, such as running the CLKs that backflipped at Le Mans and running cars in DTM. And the claims from Mercedes were that financially they would have been better off running their own team instead of just being an engine supplier. I know that sounds weird, but okay, I'll try to explain. Dieter Zech, the man with the most formidable mustache in racing, no really, move over Nigel Mansell, said that the goal for the company was to make things self-funding. While Mercedes was going to own this team, the company wasn't going to be putting its own euros into the operation. At the time this was announced, Mercedes had around a 40% stake in McLaren, but Motorsport magazine reported at the time that Mercedes was putting in its own money with not much in return. While Mercedes was going to have its own Formula 1 team, somebody else was going to be paying for it. And that's better for shareholders. What Motorsport magazine said at the time is that Mercedes was doing all this engine development and doing other bits and pieces for McLaren while owning a chunk of McLaren, but all the sponsorship that was going into the team was going to, well, McLaren. Mercedes was sat there going, well, what's in this for us? So over the next 2 years, McLaren shareholders would buy out the 40% that Daimler had in McLaren, so they'd get some of their money back on the 45% they invested into Brawn. Mercedes was supposedly looking for an out at McLaren anyway. McLaren's road car division was part of it, and while McLaren had won the Drivers' Championship in 2008, the scandals involving Spygate, losing Fernando Alonso after just 1 year, failing to win the championship in 2007 with everything that happened between Alonso and Hamilton, and then the Ligate scandal at the start of 2009, those were the extra nails in the coffin on top of everything financial. That, and Mercedes was, well, they were just the engine supplier. McLaren was getting the glory, but Mercedes was sat there going, hey, remember who gave you those engines, Ronald? In German. McLaren would continue to use Mercedes engines until the end of 2014 before they switched to Honda for 2015. Mercedes, though, now had a Formula 1 team and was now in charge of its own destiny. So, Brawn had done it. They'd won the championship, which won the hearts of Mercedes, and with Mercedes on board and buying in at the end of 2009, it allowed the talks with Petronas to start again. So in 2010, a rebranded Brawn GP appeared on the grid, occupying the first garage of the pit lane. Or the last garage in the pit lane, depending on how they wanted to do things at a specific track. They were now rebranded to the very snappily named Mercedes Grand Prix Petronas Formula 1 team, although now it's shortened to just Mercedes AMG Petronas Formula 1 team in 2025. Now, they just needed a car. Some drivers would help as well. This was because Jenson Button, who was now the world champion, was going to McLaren to join Lewis Hamilton. It was that weird statistic that over the course of 2008 and 2009, 2 British drivers, driving for 2 British teams, powered by Mercedes and carrying the number 22, won the title in Brazil. A Grand Prix where a Brazilian had started on pole, and both drivers had clinched the title by finishing 5th. Try telling that one to your mates in the pub without messing it up. Meanwhile, Rubens Barrichello, who I actually felt sorry for in 2009, was going to Williams. Go Williams. And the reason I felt sorry for Rubens is because he'd spent so many years in Schumacher's shadow, but was now at a team where he'd got a fast car, and equal footing with a teammate, so he could now have a crack at winning the championship. But he didn't. As my nan would say, oh, he's lovely. So in the December of 2009, Mercedes announced the new drivers they'd have for 2010. Incoming was Nico Rosberg, who traded places with Barrichello, but the big shock was that after a 4-year break, an old name would be returning. 7-time championship winner, 91-time race winner, the man who made non-Ferrari fans' lives a misery for 5 straight seasons, the man, the myth, the legend, the Michael. The sponsorship deal with Petronas was announced a little bit after that, but it was all wrapped up by Christmas, apparently. But there was one little setback in the setting up of the operation. This I didn't know until I looked at the dates of when Michael, Nico and everything else was finalised. There had been, apparently, a sponsorship deal signed with Henkel, a German chemical company, and this had been signed when the team was still Brawn. When Mercedes got in contact with Henkel, they went, sorry, but we haven't signed anything. Look, no offence, but we've got zero interest in being involved with Formula 1. When Mercedes inquired further, telling Henkel that an €80 million deal had been signed, it turned out that it was a fraud from a former Henkel employee with the intent of defrauding the company. The 2 parties reached an understanding, and legal action was then taken to find out who set this whole thing up. But most importantly, the Michael was back, so would he be able to pick up where he left off? Not really. The Mercedes MGP W01 was basically a rebranded Brawn 002, so it was designed on a shoestring budget and didn't really have the same performance that the previous car did. It had a higher nose cone and some other refinements compared to the previous car, such as being slightly longer to comply with the "you can't refuel anymore" rule. But with Brawn designing it with not much budget and then focusing on winning the championship that effectively saved the team, Red Bull had overtaken them, and McLaren and Ferrari had caught back up as well. The W01 was the difficult follow-up album. It was Pinkerton, A Day at the Races, One Way Ticket to Hell and Back, whatever that second Razorlight album was, or Tusk by Fleetwood Mac, although this car wasn't as overly indulgent as that album was. Sarah is a beautiful song though, I will give them that. So the car was a learning curve for Mercedes and those who stuck around from Brawn. Although, saying that, there were probably some Tyrrell guys still there. Same way there's still Benetton guys at Alpine, and I'm not just talking about Flavio. But any hope that Mercedes would come back swinging and Michael would be up at the front with him and Rosberg carrying on where Fangio and Moss left off was extinguished immediately. Ferrari, McLaren and Red Bull were the cars at the front, and Jensen in his first race for McLaren won at Melbourne just like he'd won the first race for Brawn. But now there was a budget, even if it wasn't exactly the best since Mercedes was saving some of the pennies after their purchase, but upgrades could actually be made to the car. Mercedes identified some weaknesses in the car and set about improving the car, such as increasing the wheelbase at the Spanish Grand Prix for better weight distribution, although the short wheelbase would be back for Monaco. There was, however, a unique part to this car. Most teams went for the standard tried and tested triangular roll hoop or even a more rounded one which, actually I think they banned and then made them triangular just for structural purposes. See Zhou at Silverstone. Mercedes on the other hand went for this bladed air intake, designed to suck air in and cool the engine and also do some bits and pieces aerodynamically, funneling air down towards the back as well as into the engine. But overall, it was alright, and that's really all you can say about this car. It didn't set the world on fire, but with Nico Rosberg and Michael Schumacher, they had youth, experience and two brilliant racing brains, well, engineering brains as well. Michael, well, he was Michael, and Nico is actually a very smart individual, and also a better racing driver than people give him credit for. And I appreciate that this part of the video can sound a bit disappointing. You might be thinking, hang on, he talked more about setting the team up than the actual car. Because usually when I talk about these older cars, although saying older about a car from 2010 does sound weird, there's usually some sort of funny story attached. Stories about how the car was cobbled together weeks before the start of the season, like the Brabham BT52 because the rules changed, or stories about how it broke down X many times in testing, or how they went through 97 engines in pre-season testing alone in 1991 or something. Or there might be the story of how the team did something borderline illegal to make the car faster, or flat out illegal to make the car faster. With this Mercedes? Well, there's none of that. It's a very vanilla car. I mean, I suppose we can pick apart its looks. The nose is ugly, the front wing end fence is weird, the rear wing is a bit off-putting. Someone else won't like the black splodge where the BlackBerry logo is, or the Petronas green doesn't match the silver paint, or Nico's helmet is the wrong shade of yellow, or anything else that people like to pick apart with liveries as if it matters. But on this occasion, the car was, as described, vanilla. And it's actually a good thing. Because it was so boring and almost quintessentially German in that it did what it was designed to do, Mercedes ended up with a base from which to take things. They weren't going to spend 3 seasons dissecting the car and stripping it back to nothing to find out what made it so terrible, and spend more time fixing than expanding on what they'd already got. But there were parts of the season where the car did shine. In Malaysia, Rosberg got Mercedes' first podium as a factory team since the 1955 Italian Grand Prix. He also scored a podium in China, which is where he would get Mercedes' first win 2 years later, and he also got a 3rd place at Silverstone. Michael, meanwhile, he didn't reach the podium at all. No wins, no fastest laps, no pole positions. The first time since 1991 that he hadn't done either of those things. Michael also had his worst ever finishing position in a race when he finished 15th at Valencia, and Michael also courted controversy for what happened between him and Barrichello at the Hungarian Grand Prix. But still, the team took the best of the rest honours. 214 points were scored, putting them ahead of Renault and left them in a good spot to improve. But Mercedes knew that this would take time. They'd bought a team that was grossly underfunded and produced a Hollywood happy ending, but it was going to take time to get the right funding, sponsorship and everything else into place. But they still had some good facilities they'd inherited from Honda, and they had some brilliant staff, with Brawn and Fry sticking around, as well as the likes of Pete Bonington and James Vowles. It would only be a matter of time before podiums and wins would be a regular occurrence. And in all, Mercedes only spent £137 million in buying Brawn. Forbes reported in 2020 that it was pretty cheap, all things considered. Not quite the £1 that Brawn initially paid for the team, but still, it was cheap. Forbes found some documents that detailed that when 2011 rolled around, Daimler UK and Arbar reached an agreement to purchase the remaining stock that was held by Brawn and other members of management, and this saw Mercedes take total ownership of the team. In 2012, Daimler would buy out Arbar. Arbar's share at the time was worth around $44 million, something that Daimler didn't actually pay in full. Basically, Arbar owed some money or something along those lines, so Daimler got around a £3 million discount on it. By comparison, Audi paid around £530 million for Sauber. Put into perspective, the price that Mercedes paid for Brawn equated for less than half of the team's costs in 2018. Mercedes spent around $338 million that year, with them raking in nearly $13 million in profit. This being at the height of the team's later domination, with the so-called Civil War between Hamilton and Rosberg being something that I need to look at later on. Like I've said before, I don't want to use all the good stuff up too early. I need to keep all this running as long as I can. Prior to Mercedes taking over that final share, Brawn had still got his 24.9%. The final part was sold and Brawn still continued as the team principal up until the end of the 2013 season, and everything at the time sounded incredibly positive. Mercedes, in the economic climate at the time, had managed to put together something that allowed them to be in the sport and have something that wasn't going to eat up too much of Mercedes' money. And like mentioned, it was all going to be self-sustaining through sponsorship, prize money and everything else. Schumacher by himself brought a lot of commercial interest, with Deutsche Post coming in and whatever the hell it said on his hats. German insurance company or something along those lines. I covered it in the What Do These Sponsors Do video a while back. Mercedes, at the same time, were very happy with the arrangement that they'd got. They saw the takeover as a statement of intent, and they said back in 2011 when the whole thing was finalised that they wanted to achieve all the successes possible while remaining cost effective. I mean, sure, they did end up spending a lot of money in 2018, but they ended up with, as mentioned, $13 million in profit there or thereabouts. And they hadn't received much, if anything, from Mercedes in Stuttgart. They did alright in the long term. But with all that in mind, when Mercedes bought Brawn out at the end of 2009 with all of those conditions attached to get Mercedes in and also get Petronas in, who would have thought that a few years later, a different 7-time world champion would be sat in one of those cars? So then, a look at Mercedes' purchase of Brawn and the first season they had with a largely average car that just did alright. If this has been an interesting video for you and you learned something here today, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done. And for more from the channel, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help out with the picture purchasing piggy bank or otherwise keep the lights on, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for any one and done donations and memberships for those who want to do Patreon but without going to Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.